Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ann Kinseth. I am the Director of Education here at the Meadows Museum. And thank you for choosing to take some time out of your Friday to join us kind of virtually at the museum. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Laura Varela Mejia is a second-year student in the Rhetorics of Art, Space, and Culture MA program here at Southern Methodist University. She received her BA in Art History from Williams College in 2018. She has been an intern and worked at the Williams College Museum of Art, the Pinacoteca Nazionale di Siena, the Clark Art Institute, and the Rubel Museum, where she explored her interest in art historical education and accessibility. Her current research interests include the visual and material cultural exchange between Latin America and Spain during the early modern era, visual representations of animals, and the role of translating and copying in making art. So please join me in welcoming Laura Varela Mejia.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you, Anne, for the introduction. For today's talk, I would actually like to propose that we try deconstructing the process of layering an image through a particular subset of images, sometimes referred to as flower wreath paintings or flower wreath images. And, oops. There we go. Sorry about that. The painting I am bringing to your attention is this anonymous painting that is currently held in the Meadows Museum, titled The Immaculate Conception with a Wreath of Flowers. To begin with, I just want to take a moment to delineate the way in which the image itself is engaging with this idea of layering. Starting from the foreground and going backwards, we have the titular wreath, lusciously constructed with a variety of flowers, including daffodils or narcissus flowers, roses, and tulips, among others. Behind it, we have this carved wooden frame where we can see that there's this organic curves and this particularly pleasant to look at shell-like adornment here at the top. Finally, at the very center and almost having this feeling of radiating outwards, we have this depiction of Mary standing in a group of clouds and being admired by this celestial audience of cherubs or these teeny tiny angels that are looking directly at her. We do have one more additional layer that we cannot see technically because of the digital format, but there is the extra frame that surrounds the painting when it's hung on the wall. As you might have noted from the sizes given, this 48 inches by 33 inches painting, this is relatively sizable painting where the flowers are close enough to being around life-sized, which means that the reality of this painting and others of this type are actively engaging in creating this series of framing mechanisms that are playing with this idea of what an illusion is and what we're actually seeing versus what we're not. So keeping this in mind, I propose we start looking at these layers individually, starting with where the practice of flower wreath images might have come from and what influenced their popularity during the 17th century. So the use of flower wreath images might stem in part based on an increased interest in still life paintings during the 17th century. The practice itself is often linked to the Flemish and Dutch context, but it eventually spread into other parts of Europe. This increased interest in still lifes comes in part from an existing mercantile culture in the regions. Because during the 17th century and through established trade routes with the rest of the world, there was this increasingly complex market of luxury objects and international goods that was actively thriving and developing. Within this mindset of a global trading culture, the still lifes became associated with imported goods and fruits and flowers in particular. The result is this amalgamation of objects from different parts of the world being put together, which is in part exemplified by the image that is currently on your screen. You might be able to notice that there's this imported Chinese porcelain bowl, and right next to it is this very arguably extravagant Nautilus cup with this decorations made out of gold. But we also have the Persian carpet next to it, and then there's this very carefully posed and lemon that's just flowing downwards with its peel. There is an undeniable level of this artistic skill needed to make an appealing still life. They stem from the practice of careful observation, which we can directly connect with an increased interest in scientific curiosity and observing the natural world. With the conquest of the Americas and the constant explorations that were taking place all over the world, the number of specimens to learn about and collect was only increasing. This is also, after all, the era in European history that we often associate with the more prominent role of collecting cultures and the creation of these prototypical museums in the forms of cabinets of curiosities, which, among other things, would often house still lifes and objects depicted in them. This interest in biology and nature also extended to the depictions of flowers and insects and fruits, which we will touch upon shortly as well. If you had a chance to participate in Dr. Nancy Cohen Israel's talk on still lifes back in November, she did go through a couple of different characteristics of still lifes and their importance within the Spanish context that I would not necessarily be touching upon today. But if you have not seen her talk, her recording is actually in the Meadows Museum's YouTube channel. However, I do want to touch upon one thing that she brought up, which is the idea of there being an existing hierarchy of painting genres and the general acceptance of still lifes. So the 16th, 17th centuries saw the proliferation of art academies across several different European countries, a trend that elevated the role of the artist as a creator more than a craftsman. Art academies are one of the main reasons why we can speak of there even being a hierarchy of painting genres or subjects, as they emphasize the importance of anatomical lessons and the access to live human models. As the human form as a subject became progressively associated with the idea of proper training and artistic merit, still lifes somewhat became seen as lesser. Certain artists had cleverly challenged this idea that a still life did not deal with the human form. As you can see in this still life by Clara Peters, she actually included her reflection in the picture and in a couple of other places. But for the most part, this is an exception rather than the rule. Still lifes did not usually involve the human figure at all, which led to them being understood as not requiring as much skill or being as creative as, say, history or mythological paintings or religious paintings. They were, for the most part, seen as being exemplary of the ability to copy, to observe and then imitate rather than create. And I do want to make a minor note here, since it is relevant based on the image currently on your screen, since the use of live nude models, in particular in art academies, often led to this societal understandings that it was improper for women to be artists. For this reason, most of the women artists that we know of today that were working during the 16th and 17th centuries were often apprenticed in relative studios and, for the most part, worked on still life images. This speaks to the general accessibility of still lifes as a whole, partly because you just need different objects or natural objects in particular in order to create an interesting still life. Such is the case of artists like Clara Peters here and Rachel Roich, who the latter of whom was actually known mostly as being a flower painter. Regardless, still lifes could still allow artists to have a pretty profitable career, despite the fact that they might not have access to art academies. Mostly because since there was this market for luxury goods, It follows that representations of said luxury goods were also appealing for collectors and for people to have, and were, in comparison, much easier to access and for the most part cheaper as well. So in general, still lifes had this value as commercial goods due to their displays of technical skills and their link to a cultural moment that valued the acquisition of material goods as a sign of worldliness. However, this came at the direct cost of having somewhat of moral clashes with religious doctrines and moral authorities. For if we're to see still lifes as the celebrations of earthly delights and material goods, we have this question of how to address the more heavenly or transcendental aspects that are supposed to give meaning to life beyond mortality. So then there was this fundamental issue with the construction of a still life and its relationship to religion, especially considering the context of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. Since still lifes are a form of crafted illusionism, their successes depend on the ability to be as naturalistic as possible, to convince us that the flowers we're looking at or the objects we're looking at are real in a way, which leads to somewhat of an internal contradiction, because a still life is basically an eternal memento of something that is consumable and more often than not decaying. So herein is the reason why still lifes were allowed to function within these moral constraints, the idea that they can be both celebrations of material delight as well as morally righteous images. And that is in the fact that they emphasize decay and the fact that earthly delights are finite and all of these objects of pleasure will eventually fade. So this is where the term memento mori, or the reminder of that, comes from, this idea that everything in life will eventually fade away and die and decay. So what truly matters is that which happens beyond that. And I want to take a moment to touch upon what I was mentioning about this interest in nature and observation of nature at the time, because you can not only see that we get glimpses at the different life stages of flowers in a lot of flower paintings, but we often do get these little insects that not only make the painting overall a lot more lively, but they also serve to showcase the artist's process of depicting and observing as well. At any rate, by having these decaying and wilting flowers, still lifes, especially those with fruits, flowers, and insects, could have more of that feeling, that realistic feeling of the illusion, but at the same time, they gain this really heavy symbolic layer. Because after all, they are reminders of the cruel passage of time and the finitude of pleasure. And this is where flower wreaths come in, because the flower wreath painting is a bit of an evolution or a distance from other still lifes. Now, it is often considered more of a Flemish type of still life, and it is often associated with one of the first artists that made them, Jan Bruegel. Like the popularity of other still lifes, it did spread into other European contexts, in part because of the works of artists such as Peter Paul Rubens, who was, among other things, both an artist and a diplomat for the Spanish court at the time. Unlike other types of still lifes, though, the flower wreath painting does not entirely focus on the flowers themselves and doesn't just use them as symbols or illusions, as I mentioned, but they also manifest the flowers as somewhat of an ideological framing method. By this, I mean that the flower wreath paintings position these aforementioned flower wreaths as somewhat of a mediating force between our different levels of perception of images. This is a situation that you can most often find when the flower wreath is paired with a religious image, which is arguably the most common manifestation of the type. And such is the case of this painting by Rubens and Bruegel that you can currently see on your screens. In this image, Bruegel is providing this sumptuous garland of flowers and fruits, as well as the little animals at the bottom. And he's positioning it within this illusionistic landscape that you can see, especially at the very top, you can see how it's going towards the horizon and almost pulling us in. However, in direct contrast, we then have the religious image painted by Rubens in his studio, which does not pull us in the same way, and in fact is very flat. You can even tell that it has this very delicate golden border, and it's actually hung from these. You can only see one of them, but it's hung from this little hook right here. The image of the Virgin Mary with the child is thus cast as a representation within the rest of the painting. It's not engaging in the same type of arguably deception as the flower wreath and the landscape are asking us to do. But at the same time, there's something about it about this particular painting where both aspects are being bound together without necessarily being disrupted. Like, you can believe that this representation is someone hung from this very illusionistic and magnificent flower wreath. And still, this internal frame, this golden tiny frame, is indicating to us that even though the whole painting is technically playing with ideas of an illusion of reality, one of them is the part of that's a religious image is not necessarily meant to be taken in the same level as the rest of the painting. In other words, the flower wreath and this tiny frame both allows the vision of the religious image while pairing it with the most sensorial enjoyment of the materiality of the flowers. And this has several effects with regard to what we can refer to as the main value or appeal of the flower wreath painting. The first benefit of combining these two forms is that the flower wreath painting allows us to combine this idea of sensorial lushness, both from the intricacy of the flower wreath and the thematic weight or symbolic meaning of the central religious scene. So there's this inherent collaboration between the different parts of the painting. But a collaborative element extends to the making of the flower wreath paintings themselves. As art historian Susan Miriam writes in her book, 17th Century Flemish Garland Paintings, Miriam explains that you would usually have two artists or more collaborating in the making of flower wreath paintings, with the dynamic usually entailing a figure painter executing the central scene, while a still life painter would be the one working on the wreath. And this allowed for a very pleasant collaboration between the two, as they would have their designated spaces and would rarely be interrupting or disrupting the other's works. As I mentioned before, this particular painting highlights Rubens' prowess as a painter of epic, mythological, and historical scenes, and his handling of the human form. I'm just putting an example of one of his paintings of a religious scene here on the right, the Adoration of the Magi. His mastery of the human form is, as you can probably notice, especially in the body of the baby Jesus taking center stage within the painting with the flower wreath. Bruegel, on the other hand, was known mostly for being a landscape painter and a still life artist, who was recognized in great part because of his use of texture. So the resulting painting, the flower wreath image on the left, basically highlights both artists' strengths and showcases what each of them could and were recognized for, even while sharing this singular common space. On the somewhat rare occasion when an individual artist would make a flower wreath painting on their own, the result tended to highlight their flexibility as an artist, as well as their mastery over different types of painting genres. As I mentioned before, one of the reasons why still lifes were seen as lesser was because they tended not to showcase the human figures or any sort of anatomical studies. So the flower wreath image gave artists an opportunity to almost bypass this this predisposition, and in a way showcased that an artist was capable of working in several genres at the same time, which on the one hand not only made their works more marketable, but even this took place even if they only stuck to still lifes for the most part. In her talk, Dr. Nancy Cohen Israel actually highlighted how a couple of paintings by Jan van der Hanen, which are held at the Meadows Museum, including the painting of the Virgin and Child in Glory, could be demonstrations of exactly this idea of his abilities to paint outside of still life painting. But I do want to make a brief aside that Van der Hamen also deviates from the formula even further by depicting a landscape inside a wreath, a flower wreath, in at least 2 occasions that I'm aware of. And the one on the right is particularly interesting because not only does it have this religious image on the left side of the central scene, but we also even get this glimpse at a landscape in the background. So there's 3 different genres taking place at the same time, which is pretty uncommon. I'm not particularly familiar with other paintings that do this exact thing. But basically what I want to emphasize by bringing this to is that there are several ways in which artists took this relatively stable formula and then deviated from it in creative ways, and sometimes even at times in slightly subversive ways, as I would like to believe is the case with this particular painting by Juan de Arellano. So Arellano, for the most part, was also known for his still lifes, and this painting, as you can probably tell, comes in a little later than some of the other examples I've shown, but it's pretty clever in the way in which it's challenging this idea that the central scene is supposed to be the most important part of the painting by literally covering it with the flowers from the garland. Almost, I'd like to think that it's almost making a statement as to the value of still lifes by challenging where our eyes would naturally be going to. So it could be seen as an evolution of the form of the flower wreath, where he took advantage of people's expectations and then subverted them a little bit. I was also lucky enough to actually find a picture of this image with the frame itself, and I wanted to show it just for one brief moment to emphasize the bizarre effect that it has when you just keep adding layers and layers to the image further and further back, in emphasizing the separation that we have from it. But at any rate, returning to this idea of the joint function of the flower wreath and the religious image, there is also another added element or benefit of uniting the 2 subjects, in which you could have a situation where an artist could play with the idea of balancing what is representational versus what is an illusion. So in her book, Miriam explains that flower wreaths engage with viewers in 2 seemingly contradictory ways. On the one hand, we can marvel at how they appear to be real flowers and just note how they're imitating life within the painting. But on the other hand, we also marvel at the technical skill that makes them successful at being deceitful. Basically, admiring the way in which we can observe them as being almost real, but at the same time, take into account how impressive it is that they were so close to looking real, or they are real looking in a way. So Miriam actually argues that this dual engagement encourages people to get close to flower wreath paintings or to still lifes in general, because it asks people to look for the details, to be pulled in and try to see the construction of the images, so try to find the brushstrokes and the details that artists are including, which engages us as an audience into this process of celebrating the celebration of the making of putting flower wreaths in a situation where they're naturally ask for us to look closer. This celebration of image making also positions flower wreath images in this interesting context of the artistic landscape that was built after the Protestant Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, as these historical movements had these wide repercussions in our understandings of imagery and image making. since one of the big contentious points was the nature of idolatry and the context of devotional images. One of the reasons behind some of the iconoclastic acts affected during the Protestant Reformation was the belief that religious images within the Catholic Church were being worshipped in themselves rather than being conduits for worshiping the ideas they depicted. In a way, having the representation replace that which is supposed to be honoring, which led to this understanding that images were deceitful lies, or that they were coming in the way of what truly mattered for religious purposes. Miriam argues that flower wreath images are, to an extent, a response to this criticism, but rather than trying to go away from the presentation, they actually hunkered down on this idea of being deceitful. They're internalizing their deceit, relishing in the artifice and never claiming to be truly truthful. They're still very artificially constructed, as you can probably tell. And this juxtaposition informs the way in which we take the religious image in the center to be read, not necessarily as a replacement of the religious figure depicted, but as a reference, an icon rather than an idol. And so keeping these points in mind, I want to return to our starting image, the Immaculate Conception, to reconsider how its different layers can complement each other. And to do so, I'm just going to take somewhat of a small case study focusing on the daffodils in the image. So I do want to clarify the flower symbolism is extremely complex and multifaceted, and I will not be going too much into detail in the subject, but mostly highlighting this one instance, partly because, as you can probably tell, it's depicted quite frequently in our image at hand, but also because the daffodil has this strange conflation of meanings, both from a religious context as well as more quote-unquote secular still life images. As I mentioned before, the daffodil is also known as the narcissus flower, which comes from a Greek myth, the Greek myth of Narcissus. And if you're not familiar with it, the Narcissus myth is basically the story of a young, beautiful man who fell in love with his reflection after he saw it in the water. He eventually dies, and there's different versions of this, but he eventually dies from the despair of not being able to be with the object of his desire and affection. Some stories say that he drowns, others that he just whittled, or any number of variations. But what's interesting, though, is that the place where he perished, exactly in the place where he perished, supposedly a small narcissus flower, a small daffodil, appeared, which you can see that John William Waterhouse is softly hinting at what would befall Narcissus by including the daffodils right next to him. So due to his connection with vanity and narcissism, as well as earthly delights, the daffodil tends to be a relatively common occurrence in still life paintings, somewhat of a warning sign against succumbing to our own bodily and mortal desires, which connects directly to the idea of the memento mori and the fragility of materiality and earthly life. You might have also noticed how it was actually prominently displayed in two of the paintings that I had mentioned before during this talk. You can see that one in the Peters one is particularly noticeable. However, at the same time, when we have all of these associations with materiality, the daffodils tend to also have a connection to religious imagery, as they tend to be connected to the idea of the resurrection. This latter interpretation comes from it being a perennial flower, which is to say a flower that perishes and blooms again every year. In the case of the daffodil, it blooms again during Easter, which is what connects it to this religious symbolism and significance. And this is how the same flower can have two slightly contradictory meanings depending on how you're looking at it. At the ability of looking at the same object as being representative of the ephemerality of life, as well as resurrection. And so with this, we come back to our image, because when it comes to this painting, I want to argue that this use of daffodils is every bit as effective and contradictory as the flower wreath paintings themselves. That by showing the beauty of the material beauty of the flowers and while connecting them to their religious significance, flower wreath paintings lend themselves to blur these distinctions of meaning. Like they are able to hold several different contradictory interpretations at the same time. In the case of the Immaculate Conceptions, there is this playful reminder that everything is carefully constructed and arranged. Like nothing here is done accidentally or how they would be seen in real life, for lack of a better word. So this way we can take the central image as a representation, or we can go further and see it as a representation within the overall image itself. A religious idea that is so far removed from our daily life and our lived reality that we would have to go through several different layers of image making and of interpretation in order to actually reach the idea that it's making. And at the same time, though, there is something slightly inherently humorous to me in juxtaposing this painstaking effort needed to create the ornamental garlands that decorate the internal and elaborate internal frame. And then having this teeny tiny, barely detailed lilies in Mary's hand that are equally symbolic to her figure. And I think that's one of the reasons why I personally tend to like these flower wreath images, because even though their layers are very complex and they lend themselves to thinking about these transcendental ideas, at the same time, they kind of refuse to be reduced to a single genre of image making or interpretation. Whether it be lofty and devotional, or maybe a little hedonistic, or, as I'm mentioning just right now, playful. Within these layers of frames, the illusion invites us to get lost without ever truly revealing itself. And it lets us, as an audience, to think about and play ourselves with our ideas of what is actually real and what is an illusion of what is arguably a deceit or not, or a lie or reality. Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you.
Laura, thank you so much. This talk has definitely made me realize that I have walked by this painting too many times without giving it its due. It's been really amazing to hear kind of this larger contextual framework. So now is the point that we can invite questions from all of you joining us today. As a reminder, you can either type your complete question into the chat box for me to share, or you can, in the chat box, ask to unmute yourself to ask the question yourself. We'll give you, as we give you a moment, Laura, I'll just share that someone else seconded my comment that your talk has definitely made them want to look closer at this work.
Oh, that makes me really happy. Thank you.
So our first question comes from Jean, who is curious about if some of the artists you've covered, if they actually write about their intent, about what they were trying to do.
I will admit I am not familiar with any particular writings from artists that cover this. But I think it is a worthwhile endeavor to try to find them. I'm unfortunately not familiar with them. I'm sorry to say.
No, fair enough. So our next question, actually, Phyllis is wondering, Phyllis, I'm wondering if you could maybe use the chat box to expand a little bit on your question. I'm not sure I quite understand what you're asking. So I'll give you a moment to do that while we'll go to Stephanie's question, which is if she's wondering if there was a certain time period in which these wreath images were kind of most prominent.
Absolutely. For the most part, they tend to be associated with the 17th century, so the 1600s. The ones that I brought up in this talk were mostly from the first half of the 17th century with Juan de Arellano making the one that was in 1652. So that one's a little later. As you can probably tell from the attribution of the Immaculate Conception, it's dated as 17th century, probably because of that.
Great. So back to Phyllis's question. She's wondering if the flowers have an element of decay, like the memento mori.
Absolutely. And so I'm going to stop in this one and then maybe go back to the Rachel Roach painting, since that one's a bit more visible. But you can see, for example, this tulip at the very top, like the outer petals are starting to fall off, but we also have a couple that are in a bit of a better state. Same thing is noticeable with the roses. You can see that this ones haven't bloomed yet, and this other one right here is starting to become a little more sad looking, for lack of a better word. And if we go back to the Rachel Roach painting, if I can figure out how to access that. I'll just click through it on this. We go back to the Rachel Roach painting, which I believe was right here. You can actually see that this one's a lot more focused on this idea of decay and the flowers just slowly becoming unraveled. Caravaggio also has a couple of other still lifes where the idea of decay is further emphasized, but it really does depend on the artist's choice. And especially here, sometimes you can even see flower petals at the bottom of the painting, like they've been falling from the moment when the artist started to depict them.
Thank you. So the next question is from Maria, who is curious about the scenes within the scenes. So she notes that there seem to be religious scenes that are depicted, perhaps some mythology and landscape, but she's wondering if there were ever historical events, or if there's any images you know of historical events like battles.
For the most part, I will admit I haven't seen any battles. In fact, as I pointed out when we were looking at these two paintings, landscapes themselves were also somewhat of a surprising case. With this one on the left being particularly strange because you can barely, or at least you can barely detail what's happening with the mountain, and then you have this tiny village far off in the distance. But there's a possibility that they do exist. I just personally have not found any. They mostly tend to focus on saints and a lot of paintings with Mary in particular.
Okay, so the last question we currently have in the chat box is more about kind of the art market and the production of these images. So Andre is wondering if they tended to be commissioned by individuals. Were they things that you could buy in a storefront?
That is a pretty great question, because there's in the background of this whole process of engaging with still life images, there's a context of artistic guilds, especially in the Dutch and Flemish contexts. And as I believe Dr. Nancy Cohen-Israel mentioned, a lot of still lifes were just made and then sold without being commissioned. So as far as I know, that might have also been the case with these flower wreath images, but then you have really elaborate ones like the one made by Rubens and Bruegel that I would think this one was commissioned. It feels too elaborate, and the collaborating elements feel too specific. So I don't have a way to fully say that yes, they were made by commission or no, they weren't, but I have the feeling that a lot of them were made for a greater open market, just like most still lifes were.
And to follow up, do you know if there were any particular images that were more marketable than others? So Andre's wondering if, for example, the BVM and floral works were more marketable.
With respect to still lifes or to flower wreath images?
These wreaths, and Andre, please correct me if I'm getting this wrong. I'm curious if these were on the market, if there were, certain images that made them sell better or kind of get into people's hands, however that happened.
From what I've seen, from what I've seen, one of the most common images depicted at the center, like this religious image, it tends to be Mary. And part of that stems from her connection with a lot of flower symbolism. Like I mentioned, she has those little lilies in the Immaculate Conception painting at the Meadows, but she's also often connected with roses um, and with daffodils to an extent. And this is somewhat unrelated subject, but we also see these associations between Miriam and flowers within a Latin American context too. So her figure lends itself a lot for this specific type of image. And so I would argue it's probably that one. Lot of Marys.
Great. Okay, we have two more questions that I think we'll have time for. The first one is related to the Rubens and the Bruegel piece you showed that seemed to be a collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
And how I was curious if you know anything about how those two work together, if they divvied up their work, one takes flowers, one takes, image, or how that might have worked.
So with this painting specifically, and this tends to be the case for the ones that we know are collaborations, they would decide which part was going to be worked on by which artist, and then they would divide who was doing the main religious painting and who was doing the flower wreath. So in this particular case, if I understand correctly, the Rubens and studio contribution is just the central image right here. While Bruegel, as far as I understand, is the one that did the entirety of the wreath, as well as the landscape and some of these small, tiny animals around it. As to which part would be done first, I would guess that in this specific case, the Rubens section was done first, not only because it's a lot easier to segment, you can actually tell there's a very specific shape that it has. And there's also these tiny leaves on top of it, which lend me to believe that Bruegel was the one that worked second. But this might depend on the artist and who was working on a specific painting. And if you have cases such as this one, even though this one is only made by a single artist, it really showcases just the separation between the two aspects. So from a very practical perspective, this type of images are just really nice for several artists coming in and working together, because you wouldn't have to actually touch or mess with the part that the other person was doing.
Great. So I think the last question we have is one that I know you and I chatted about a little bit before this talk. Terry is wondering, with the Meadows image that was really the focus of your talk today, is there anything in that image that really distinguishes it as Spanish as opposed to Flemish?
So that is a tricky question, and you might have noticed this. It's anonymous. As far as I was able to see, the Meadows doesn't have a specific attribution to it, and that is one of the really big questions about it, because there's really no way for us to know, or at least none that I know of personally, because on the one hand, it could have been made by a Spanish artist following Flemish types and methods, or arguably prints that were made of other paintings that existed. And as I mentioned, other artists such as Rubens and Bruegel did bring the idea into Spain, but at the same time could have been made by a Flemish artist and then bought and taken to Spain. That's also another possibility. So it's one of those uncertainties that are really interesting to think about, but I don't know if we'll ever get a certified answer of whether or not it is.
Well, Laura, thank you so much. This has been it's expanded the way I think about this book so much. And from reading the comments in the chat box, I think I'm not alone in that. So thank you for all your preparation and really bringing this work to life for us. And I want to thank all of you for joining us this Friday. This presentation for me talked a lot about the idea of deceit and of painters painting, which reminds me, if that's something of interest to you, that on February 18th, we will have a lunchtime lecture on Velázquez, who is a master at this. And we will be joined by Rebecca Quinteresi, and an artist named Santiago Garcia, who won a pretty prestigious comic book award for his comic, and it's a collaborative work, but his role in a comic that kind of examines the idea of a masterpiece and puts Las Meninas at the center. So I just dropped a link into the chat box for that, and hopefully we see some of you registered, because we would love to keep thinking about this idea with you. So thank you again, Lara, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you for the kind comments. I really appreciate it.